With 2024 drawing to a close, it's time to look back at all the videos I've made this year. Now, most people would look back at their best and most viewed videos, but I'm built different. So today we're going to look back at the videos that for whatever reason didn't take off on YouTube. These videos were overlooked by the YouTube algorithm, and so probably you haven't seen them. So I'm going to give them a second chance with this video. I guess you could say this is like a worst of 2024 video compilation, but personally I would say worst is actually a bit unfair because there really isn't much correlation between the quality of a YouTube video and how it does on the algorithm. So without further ado, here are my least viewed videos of 2024. Hope you enjoy. Before its release, Half-Life 2 was a very different game. It was a much darker setting where the Combine had done even more damage to the planet and its people. Pre-release versions of Half-Life 2 featured completely drained oceans, child labor, and also, for some reason, Gordon Freeman rode a jet ski. Yes, you heard me right. In the original version of Half-Life 2, Gordon Freeman rode a jet ski along the canals of City 17. Now, you're probably asking, what were they thinking? What were they smoking to have Gordon Freeman riding around the post-apocalyptic canals of City 17 on a jet ski? And honestly, I couldn't tell you. They apparently only cut it because it didn't work properly. The model is so weird looking. According to the Combine Overwiki, it's based on some kind of old-fashioned style jet ski. And you can see in this image that they mounted a gun on it. To me, it makes it feel like Gordon Freeman's going on vacation to the Bahamas and not fighting his way through zombie-infested sewers and canals. So there you have it, the precursor to the airboat. Now, I know a lot of people hate the airboat, but I think that this somehow would have been worse. Or maybe not. Let me know what you think. In a previous video, I read the official guide for Half-Life 2 to find weird and interesting things hidden within its hundreds of pages of text. So today I set out to read the guide for the original Half-Life. However, I did make one mistake. I accidentally read the official guide for the Dreamcast version of Half-Life, which actually never came out. Strangely, it was cancelled so late in development that the guide had already basically been released. So that's why there are still copies of it floating around on the internet. And while I was searching for the Half-Life official guide, I accidentally stumbled upon this one instead. I should have been paying more attention because it does say Dreamcast on the cover. So after I realized this, I did go back to see how similar it is to the original Half-Life guide for PC, and I did find that they are pretty similar. There are some sections that are exactly the same word for word. These are written and published by the same person and company. The author is, however, different from the Half-Life 2 guide. This time it is written by Joe Grant Bell, but it is still published by Prima or Prima, don't know how to say it. This time the guides are seemingly printed in black and white. The covers are in color, but all the pages inside are in black and white. I don't have a physical copy of the guide, so it's possible that whoever scanned it in black and white, but since the covers are in color, I'm going to assume that the guides are officially in black and white, which is kind of a shame because they would probably be a lot more readable and enjoyable if they were in color. A lot of the screenshots from the games are, you know, a little bit muddled, I guess, just because of the nature of black and white printing. So anyway, some other differences between the PC version of the guide and the Dreamcast version of the guide is that the Dreamcast one is just so much more intense in its presentation. The fonts are weirder. Each page is more grungy, and there's all these cutouts of characters and enemies filling every single blank available space. I do like the more detailed, at least I feel like it's more detailed way that they did the walkthrough in the Dreamcast version. which I think it's actually much more similar to how it's presented in the Half-Life 2 Prima Guide. So I think that's just showing how the publisher evolved over time, but it's entirely subjective and maybe you prefer the original version. So without further ado, let's take a look at some strange, interesting, and funny things from the original Half-Life guide. So on page 4, we learn that leeches are also called hagworms in the Half-Life 1 guide. Just an interesting alternate name for these creatures. On page 5, just like in the Half-Life 2 guide, they don't mention that the pistol can fire underwater. I don't know why this is something that doesn't show up in the guide. They make a very big point of saying how the crossbow can fire underwater, but never the pistol. On page 9, the guide reminds you not to snark yourself. On page 11, the game describes an item in the game as confusing. On page 13, the head crab zombie is referred to as a maw man. Now, that's an interesting term that I hadn't really heard before. Maybe it was the official term when the first Half-Life came out, but by the time that Half-Life 2 came out, and definitely by the time I started playing Half-Life 2 and Half-Life, everybody referred to these as head crab zombies. On page 16, we learn that you can kill Gargantua with just your regular weapons, although it is not recommended. On page 17, we learn that assassins are deadly. On page 22, the guide gives us some FPS strategy, which is interesting, especially since the original Half-Life, when it came out, FPS was a much younger genre, so I think it's kind of helpful that the game gives a lot of useful tips here. On page 29, Gordon looks very lost. On page 30, Step 1. Your train makes no stops. Step 2. At one point, your train stops. On page 51, tip, don't move around much while the cart is in motion, or you will fall off. Page 57, tip, if you stay in the elevator, it will plummet into a pool of toxic sludge. Feels like it's recommending that you do that and not, like it's not a warning, it's a tip, you know? Page 67. We recommend ignoring the rail cart this time. Towards the end of the guide, there is also a section on Half-Life Blue Shift, but it's interesting that I guess the Dreamcast version was going to have both the original game and Blue Shift, so, well, I guess it's a shame that it never came out. After that, I wanted to share some cheats that you had on the Dreamcast version of Half-Life 2 for anyone who is, I guess, looking to use some cheats in this one. It's like, this one's called Zen Teaches Black Mesa, and it adds Zen gravity on Earth. Soldiers ignore Gordon, and that's no target mode. Otis loves Dreamcast. That's God mode. I don't know who Otis is. Maybe that's the dog from Garfield, I guess. Dreamcast gives firepower. That one's infinite ammo. Next we have action ignore silence, and that's slow motion mode. Anyways, that was the Half-Life guide for Dreamcast. It's pretty similar to the regular Half-Life guide, which I accidentally didn't read. Thanks for watching. I guess it's time to dredge even deeper into the abyss of Half-Life 2 discussion. So these are just some random thoughts about Half-Life 2, though I'm stringing them together with the theme of how Half-Life 2 has stayed relevant despite being about 20 years old. In Half-Life 2, nothing comes between you and the gameplay. Video games have changed a lot since Half-Life 2's release in 2004, and honestly, much of what's been added to your average AAA game these days is simply bloat. I guess tastes have changed over time, and I'm sure you can find counterexamples, but for me nothing beats the simplicity of Half-Life 2's gameplay. For example, something I love about Half-Life 2 is its lack of some kind of weapon or skill progression system. I don't want to get bogged down deciding whether I want my gun to reload 5% faster or do 10% more damage per shot. I just want to shoot head crabs. Even without a progression system, Half-Life 2 manages to naturally increase your firepower as you go through the story. Having an NPC hand you a badass weapon is so much more meaningful and memorable than spending upgrade points in a convoluted menu system. Half-Life 2 is full of these moments, such as when Father Grigori tosses you the shotgun, or when Colonel Cubbage gives you the rocket launcher to defeat the gunship. However, even Valve themselves have started using weapon upgrade mechanics, with Half-Life Alyx being the first game in the series to feature upgrades for the weapons. They try to hide this by making the upgrade menus diegetic, but honestly that just raises more questions. Why would the Combine have weapon upgrade machines when they would probably manufacture the fully upgraded weapons at a factory? Do the Combine have to go look for resin when they want to upgrade their gun? And why did they design a minigame for people trying to hack into their fabricators? None of these questions come up in Half-Life 2 because it wisely avoids the narrative clunkiness of an upgrade system in favor of just handing you a more powerful gun when you need it. This isn't to say that I don't think games should have these kind of RPG style systems, but I think that not every game requires this kind of progression. Game design isn't just about the mechanics that are added to the game, but also the ones that aren't. If I had any criticism of the weapon system in Half-Life 2, it's that they don't switch out the weapons in the episodes. In episodes 1 and 2, Gordon is once again finding the same exact weapons, when it really would have been nice if Valve bothered to design a few new ones. Because of this, there are also fewer memorable weapon introductions in the episodes, with only the Magnuson device getting the proper treatment. Pretty much every other weapon is just found on the floor, because it would be odd to make a big deal out of a gun that you're already familiar with. There's almost nothing in Half-Life 2 that gets in the way of immersion. Cutscenes are not used in favor of letting you follow conversations naturally, or do parkour around the room until the characters finally shut up and open the door. I suppose modern game design principles dictate that cutscenes should be skippable, and the story moments in Half-Life 2 do essentially amount to unskippable cutscenes. But I do admire Valve for not going for the cinematic cutscene route. Half-Life 2 plays out in one long, unbroken perspective, and nothing is skipped. Every inch of Gordon's journey from start to finish is witnessed and controlled by the player. I will admit that one bit where you are restrained and forced into a slow-moving theme park ride through the Citadel is a little much. But we all make mistakes sometimes. I guess that's what NoClip is for. Speaking of NoClip, I would also just like to thank Valve for including the command console in their game. It makes creating these videos so much easier. There are so many games that don't have these features and are as a result so much more of a pain to make videos about. I'm looking at you, Dishonored. These days, open world games are all the rage, and some might think that Half-Life 2 might suffer from its linear nature. But from my perspective, Half-Life 2 gets linear game design right. Often, the level design is so natural that you're almost always drawn down the correct path in the game, while still feeling like you're exploring the world for yourself. Again, simplicity reigns supreme in Half-Life 2. With the linear nature keeping the focus on the forward momentum and narrative of the game. Something I've noticed about the series as a whole is how it's settled into familiarity since Half-Life 2. The jump from Half-Life 1 to 2 is pretty immense and drastically changes the setting, the enemies, and the weapons. However, subsequent games don't stray far from what was laid out in Half-Life 2. It's difficult to imagine that Half-Life 3 would feature villains that aren't the Combine. I guess that's partially because the story of Half-Life 2 remains incomplete. Still, I would advocate for Valve to take a risk and surprise us, as a traditional continuation of the story will most likely end up underwhelming after 20 years of hype. So what's the takeaway here? You should replay Half-Life 2. Though, to be fair, if you're following this channel, you're probably already doing that. Thanks for watching. When I was a kid, my family didn't really do the big name video game consoles. Instead, we had these plug-and-play consoles with an assortment of classic video games. So despite growing up in the 2000s, the games I played when I was young were from the 1980s. We had Miss Pac-Man, Pole Position, Frogger, and more. However, there is one game that I remember more than all the others. That game is Xevious. In Xevious, you play as an experimental fighter jet battling aliens in a vertically scrolling shooter. Most other shooter games coming out in the late 70s and early 80s were set in space. That meant a black background with stars, which is a somewhat boring backdrop, even if the gameplay is interesting. Although Xevious might not look like much today, it was ahead of its time. Instead of the empty void of space, the battles in Xevious take place above a lush patchwork of forests, plains, and country roads. I played many hours of this game as a kid. I don't think I was that great at it, but I did manage a few times to get past the first boss. Personally, I wanted to get as far as I could in the game, not because I wanted to beat the game, but because I just wanted to see what areas came next. There was always a fascinating mystery with what lay beyond. After the first boss battle, for example, I found a vast ocean that seemed to stretch on forever, although that was mostly because I kept dying there. Honestly, I'm not sure if I ever found out what was beyond it. One thing about Xevious is just how devious it is. It lives up to its quarter-eating arcade origins by spiking in difficulty the longer you stay alive. And the more points you get during a life, the harder the game gets. If you destroy all the regular alien ships in the first area, it will suddenly send a rain of super fast, near unavoidable enemies in your direction. This means that depending on how well you play the game, it's different each time you play. As a kid, this added to the mystery and replayability of the game, even if now, understanding how it works, it's quite a simple and slightly cynical way to design an arcade game. Now, the story of Xevious isn't explained within the game. It goes straight into the airborne combat and skips over any formalities like cutscenes or Star Wars-style scrolling text. All you get when you start the game is the announcement that you have 2 Solvalu left. What is a Solvalu? Well, it's the name of the ship you're piloting. I think it also intentionally sounds like something that would emerge from the depths of the Soviet space program. Also, I've now heard people pronounce it both Solvalu and Solvalu, so who knows how you're supposed to say it. Apparently, in addition to not having any opening cutscenes or introduction, the original Xevious doesn't even have a victory screen. If you get to the end of the game, it just loops back to the start. So for lore, we'll have to dive into the manuals and game guides that were created for the game. So what is the story of Xevious? Well, it's a bit more interesting than I expected. The Xevious people, sometimes referred to as Xevions, were a group that inhabited the planet prior to the last ice age. Because it got a little cold, they left our planet. But now, since we've warmed it up for them, they're back to evict us. One of the taglines in the manual is, "We have seen the aliens and they are us," implying that the humans are not actually from Earth in this game, but this isn't expanded upon in any of the documents I could find about Xevious. Anyways, the Xevions seem to be doing a pretty good job at taking over Earth and are happily making themselves at home. Humanity's last hope is the state-of-the-art Solvalu fighter. Your goal is to destroy the mothership of the Xevions, which will presumably lead to the collapse of their forces. Kind of like in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. One bit of lore that's not mentioned in the guides are the Nazca lines that are found in several parts of the game. I wonder if this is somehow related to the quote-unquote theories that aliens played a part in the creation of the Nazca lines? but I couldn't find anything to support or disprove that. There are 32 enemies in Xevious, which are split between ground and air units. Let's go through some of my favorites. The first flying enemies you encounter in the game are known as toroids. I love the design of these ships and how they take the flying saucer type ship and put a little spin on it by making it hollow. They're worth 30 points if you kill them, which isn't very much. These chaps are also kind of cowardly, darting toward the edge of the screen, away from your Solvalu. Sometimes, depending on their mood, they will fire off a single shot while retreating, but otherwise they are mostly harmless. I consider them to be some kind of scouting ship, but that's just based on vibes. Another flying enemy that is encountered early in the game is the Torcan. These guys remind me of TIE fighters. They swoop in, fire off a shot, and leave. They're pretty tame on their own, but they usually come in small groups, which can pose a challenge. The weirdest enemy, if you can call it an enemy, is the Bakura. These are basically just flying slabs of what might be concrete or metal. They move slowly toward you and cannot be killed. Honestly, that kind of sounds like an eldritch horror, except it's just a piece of sheet metal. Now, by far the largest enemy in the game is the Andor Genesis, which serves as the boss of the game. It appears at set intervals, blocking your progress until you either damage it or live long enough for it to get bored and leave. It shoots these cannonball-looking projectiles at you, which I find just so infuriating to dodge. I'll be honest, I'm not very good at shoot-'em-up games, so this guy usually kills me. In addition to the aerial enemies, there's also a lot of ground-based units that you use your bomber to destroy. You've got your pyramid buildings, both large and small. I like that you can blow off the top of the large pyramid. That's a really nice detail. You've got your circle and square buildings. The simple buildings usually come in pairs or groups of 4, and if you bomb the center between them, both of the buildings explode. There's also more advanced buildings, like the Oza Logram and the Garu Dorota, which can really catch you out with their superior firing rate. Additionally, there are moving ground units such as these octagonal tanks. As a kid, my shoot-'em-up game skill was certainly lacking, so encountering enemy types beyond the ones previously mentioned was a rare occurrence. These tougher late-game enemies were shrouded in mystery, and only seen when I somehow made it past the first mothership. Seeing one was like seeing an actual UFO. And honestly, whenever I saw one, I usually died because I would be too interested in the ship design to actually try to fight it. There are these alien T-shaped ships, these strange flying saucers with saw blade edges, and these ultra-fast energy orbs which rain down upon you without warning. Something I also learned from reading the guide is that in addition to ground and air enemies, there are also these underground enemies. If you bomb the right patch of ground, you can reveal another structure to destroy. According to Masanobu Endo, who led the design of the game, the concept for Xevious as a scrolling shooter game was handed to him by the marketing department of Namco. They wanted to compete with the other popular shooter games of the time, and it was his job to turn their vague idea into reality. The game went through several iterations, including one where the Solvalu was a helicopter. In addition to designing the game, Masanobu Endo did a great deal of the art for Xevious. For the time, Xevious had spectacular graphics, and can be especially lauded for how it created the illusion of 3 dimensions in enemies such as the Bakura. Masanobu Endo refers to the technique used in the creation of the sprites as ray tracing by hand rendering, which I find to be a fascinating term. Certainly, we would consider a great deal of this work basic pixel art skills today, but that just goes to show how far video games have come. Upon its release as an arcade game, Xevious was extremely successful in Japan, though it was less popular in the United States. Masanobu Endo, who was new to video game development when he made Xevious, went on to make many more video games, and even founded his own game studio, which he called Game Studio. Xevious itself went on to inspire many future games in the shoot-'em-up genre, and then it ended up on a plug-and-play console that my parents bought at Target. What a journey. Today we're going to talk about Mappy, an arcade game that haunts my dreams. Growing up, I played this game on a plug-and-play console which included many of Namco's old games. Now, Mappy was by far the strangest of the games included on this console, as the other things included were Miss Pac-Man, Xevious, Galaga, and Pole Position, all of which are considered classics and generally make sense. Mappy, however, is a video game where you play as a police officer mouse trying to recover stolen goods from a gang of criminal cats. I feel like a mouse is the worst kind of police officer you could send to arrest a gang of cats, but I suppose the local police department just really wants this mouse dead. And you know what, you gotta give the game credit because it is realistic in that you will be dying over and over again to these cats. So you start the game in this really strange house with a bunch of stolen goods to collect and a bunch of cats running around. There's also some random guy wearing red. Don't know much about him, but I think he's also pretty dangerous. The first thing you'll notice about the house is that instead of having something logical like stairs or an elevator, you travel between the floors using a trampoline. But that's not all. If you jump on this trampoline one too many times, it breaks and you will fall to your death. Your only defense against the cats that are hunting you down is to open a door in their face. You'd think that as a mouse facing down a gang of organized criminal cats, you would bring a gun, but I guess a door will do. I would say the gameplay here is kind of like Pac-Man, if you imagine the cats as the ghosts and the stolen goods as those little pellets you eat. In between collecting stolen goods, there's also a bonus stage where you collect balloons. I guess that's what ACAB really stands for. All cops are balloons. Growing up, what was really frustrating about this game was that the joystick controller for the plug-and-play console I had wasn't really suited at all for this kind of gameplay. The joystick controls made a lot of sense in Xevious, Galaga, and Pac-Man, but for Mappy, a traditional platformer, it was just really awkward to jump about and dodge all the cats, and so I just end up dying over and over again. Honestly, with the number of mice that I killed in this game, I should have become an exterminator. But instead I'm here making YouTube videos. While we all wait for Half-Life 3 like that dog in Japan who waited for his dead owner at a train station for 10 years, some of us are probably going a little insane. To prevent this, I think we need to inject a little bit of Half-Life into every game we play. I've already talked about how we can do this with video games, but today we are improving board games by adding some Half-Life to them. Let's start with chess, the thinking man's checkers. It's a classic game, but it's certainly no Half-Life 2. First, let's redesign the pieces. Some highlights from this would be Barney as all the resistance pawns, 2 Citadel rooks, Breen as the Combine Queen, and Vortigaunt's as the resistance bishops. However, changing the look of the pieces isn't enough. We need to inject some Half-Life gameplay into chess, otherwise it just won't feel right. So, if we say Gordon is the resistance side's king, Let's give him his full arsenal of weapons. He can beat nearby pieces to death with his crowbar, fling enemy pieces across the board with the gravity gun, take out large swaths of enemy forces with the rocket launcher, and even fire that energy ball that vaporizes his foes. That sounds like a perfectly balanced game of Half-Life chess to me. Up next, we've got Scrabble. Injecting Half-Life into Scrabble might be a little difficult. We could start by making some of the words from Half-Life like headcrab, zen, vortigaunt, and zombine into valid Scrabble words. I think we should also add a lambda tile to the game. It can't be played as part of any word in the Scrabble dictionary, but to balance that, we could make it worth a lot of points. Monopoly could also use a Half-Life overhaul. You could make one of the little pieces that you play as into a crowbar, but then everyone would want to play as the crowbar. But that's fine. Just make all the pieces the crowbar. What about everyone's favorite board game, the Game of Life? Just chop that bad boy down the middle and you've got yourself Half-Life. For more advanced board gamers, Wingspan could also be injected with Half-Life 2. To make the game more accurate to the Half-Life franchise, we can simply remove any birds that don't appear in Half-Life 2. The 3 types of birds in Half-Life 2 are pigeons, crows, and seagulls, so just take out all the other cards and you'll have yourself a Half-Life edition of Wingspan. What about Settlers of Catan? Look folks, just because Half-Life 3 isn't out yet, doesn't mean you have to play Settlers of Catan. There are plenty of other games out there. Anyways, I hope that this video has brought you some hope in these trying times. If you want more Half-Life videos, be sure to subscribe because I occasionally make those.